The country is in mourning after the second deadliest school shooting in U.S. history. The Senate has opened debate on which immigrants can stay and who must stay away. Plus, intelligence officials say we can count on Russian meddling in the 2018 midterm elections. And it's only Thursday. I'm Molly Roberts with Post Opinion writers Karen Tumulty, Christine Emba, and EJ Dion. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, send in your comments and questions, and we'll try to bring them on the show. First, a deadly school shooting unfolded in real time Wednesday as students live tweeted the assault on their Parkland, Florida high school. Suspect Nicholas Cruz is booked in a Florida jail on 17 counts of murder premeditated. Police say he returned to the South Florida high school he was expelled from last year, pulled a fire alarm, and shot at students and teachers with an assault-style weapon. President Trump addressed the nation today, a day after the shooting.
Our administration is working closely with local authorities to investigate the shooting and learn everything we can. We are committed to working with state and local leaders to help secure our schools and tackle the difficult issue of mental health. Later this month, I will be meeting with the nation's governors and attorney generals. We're making our schools and our children safer will be our top priority.
So, what was missing, guys, from Trump's speech?
Guns.
I think we can all agree.
Yeah, I think what was remarkable about what he said is that he so very clearly focused on mental health in that way that he made the empty space seem all the more obvious and all the greater. And just if I could say, I think it's so dispiriting that I went back this morning and looked at old columns I'd written and other people had written, and the same thing happens every single time. And we mourn that we can't do anything about this, but of course we can do something about this, but we're unwilling to act. And the array of politics, and I would argue particularly the commitment of Republicans and conservatives to the NRA, makes it impossible even to get tiny little things, tiny steps forward.
Like bump stocks.
But even Trump has a record here too, and even on mental health. Within the first month of his presidency, he signed legislation that rolled back an Obama-era regulation where if somebody was either receiving Social Security benefits because of a mental disorder or had been deemed unfit to handle their own affairs, they were automatically put into the gun database. He got rid of that regulation. So as much as he talks about wanting to do something about mental health, other than curing everyone who has mental illness, you know, how would he relate that to their ability to get weapons?
Precisely.
Yeah, and I think there's more of a bad record in this budget that he just proposed. He proposed cutting millions of dollars from the background check system. So really, it's not just doing nothing, it's actively doing harm, even on this issue that he says he's going to try to move forward on.
It's interesting, too, that so many Republican congresspeople have called for us not to make assumptions or jump to conclusions without further study on how guns or gun regulation might influence events like this, when in fact the CDC has been prevented by legislation from researching gun deaths or the effect of guns or anything that can be done to stop this, in part because of funding and pushback from the NRA and congresspeople who are tied to that funding. Actually, on the internet, this was a particularly interesting shooting to follow for me, which is an awful thing to say because it implies that there's so many shootings that we're just like following them online now, which we are. But you see that the kids in the school were tweeting about it, and even as this was happening, congresspeople were saying, "Oh, thoughts and prayers," and there were others who immediately responded to these tweets with, "Well, thoughts and prayers and your $3.3 million from the NRA, Marco Rubio."
Right. No, that was really powerful. And you know, thoughts and prayers have become almost sacrilegious at this point because they are a stand-in for action. And I think what both of you underscored was really important because what you're seeing is that any movement on any front is going to be stopped by the NRA. And so they will talk about mental health. And again, mental health is now used not in a serious way. It's just as a shield against gun control. But when you have real efforts to keep guns out of the hands of the mentally ill, even those go too far. And then the ban on research, it really is an astonishing admission that they don't want us to know anything about how guns contribute to death and violence and health. And it's just an astonishing place we are. And no democracy in the world is in the same place we are on this.
Yeah, we have a comment on Facebook to that effect. Russell Ingram says, voting matters. Republicans are owned by the NRA. They will continue to do nothing. They will continue to shout this is a mental health issue, while countries like Switzerland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Germany all have citizens with mental health issues, yet their gun violence is almost zero.
Yeah, amen
Absolutely.
to that. I think the other problem we have, by the way, is the United States Senate, the existence of the way it's apportioned, because the United States Senate vastly overrepresents rural areas. And when I looked it up, and when the Manchin Toomey bill was voted down, it actually got 54 votes, but it couldn't meet the filibuster. Those 54 represented something like 2/3 of the American population. But the NRA is particularly strong in swing states, and so you lose almost all Republicans. The NRA is very overwhelmingly pro-Republican. But then you also start losing Democrats in those swing states who are very worried about the influence of the NRA. So you've got the combination of conservative ideology that is really thrown in with the gun ideology, but then you've got the Senate problem, which even pushes some Democrats, I think some of whom probably know better, although I can't say that for sure, who end up voting that way also.
You know, I will say, though, and that the question of mental health is a useful and interesting one for us to think about as a society. I mean, when you think about what we know about this shooter, that he had relationship problems, that he was apparently abusive to people in his general environment, and the profile of many of these mass shooters, there's often a domestic violence background of some kind. There's often sort of, yes, mental illness or mental problems. There's often perhaps a crisis of masculinity even that is involved here, in which young men especially, I think, are trained to view emotions in a certain way. You can express anger. You can't express, however, fear. It's not appropriate to necessarily go and talk to people. And so perhaps they do resort to behaviors like this. And that is something that I think that we need to tackle as a country. And while gun violence is also a huge problem, there are other societal questions that need to be answered to prevent these outbreaks that keep on occurring. And we think about thoughts and prayers, and we say thoughts and prayers and condolences and then move on. And we don't really address the underlying questions.
Yeah, on Facebook, Michael Watt is trying to bring up some other issues than the ones we've been talking about. He asks, why don't you talk about divorced liberals and latchkey kids and lack of morals and ethics, which are extremely low, especially from the Democrats and Clintons, and is the main cause of kids who shoot at schools, not gun issues? So I think we probably disagree that this has something to do with the lack of morals that the Clintons are bringing into society, but I do think that he's trying to bring into it kind of an idea of, are there underlying societal issues here?
I can't resist pointing out that the divorce rates in more liberal states are actually lower than the divorce rates in conservative states, if he wants to bring that topic up. And I just don't see where that gets us in general. I mean, I don't he and I might have a useful conversation. I think family matters. I think the way kids are treated matters. And that we should worry about the state of the family, the struggles of single moms, and how we can help kids in families with only one parent. We can have a whole conversation about family and be serious about it. I just don't see that as an excuse to evade conversation about things that could more immediately stop events like this.
And what we're seeing in these, because these incidents are becoming so common, we are seeing them involving perpetrators who come from almost any conceivable background. Sandy Hook was a single mom. Columbine were a couple of kids from intact families.
Yes, exactly right.
Here you have a kid, an adult, a young adult who had just lost his adoptive mother, but another family had actually stepped in and tried to take over. He was getting at least some, we're going to learn a lot more, but it appears that he was getting some kind of mental health treatment. These circumstances are so different in all of these cases, sadly, because they've become so frequent.
And the one thing that they do have in common, of course, is that these freakily disturbed youths are able to get their hands on assault weapons and huge magazines and the ability to go into a school or another place and shoot people. There's one thing that they have in common. It's the ability of guns.
I think it's
the availability of guns.
And since our friend has mentioned Bill Clinton, it is worth noting that Bill Clinton signed the assault weapon ban that made events like this a little less likely. And then the assault weapons ban expired. It needed to be renewed, and it wasn't. So I think whatever problems you might have with Bill Clinton, a lot of people have differences with Bill Clinton. I think not on this one. I think in this area of all others, is an area where he actually tried to stand up for somewhat more reasonable gun laws.
But another problem with gun laws has been that, for instance, with the assault weapons ban, the gun makers and their gun proponents were able to write ways around it. If you called it something other than an assault weapon, if you added a few little gizmos and changed the way it worked, it could get around the assault weapons ban.
Right, but if we were serious, in other words, if we had a serious national commitment to say, we don't really think these weapons belong in the hands of ordinary people, it's okay, there are plenty of weapons we have in this country, this one is not one that should be out there for the reasons we saw yesterday. If you had goodwill on this and were actually serious about legislating, you can figure out ways around that. You can we do update law to fit new circumstances, but what we end up doing is having these enormous struggles when we actually can win these bills. The bills end up being narrow, and then opponents of gun control, the NRA, block any further efforts to update them or move forward.
So the gun conversation probably isn't one we can talk about enough, but we do have limited time, and there's a whole other group of children who are in danger in a different way. Congress opened a long-awaited immigration debate this week that could determine the fate of undocumented immigrants brought to the United States as children, and the future of our entire legal immigration system. Democrats are focused on protecting foreign-born dreamers from deportation, while President Trump is focused on funding a border wall, restricting family-based migration, and ending the diversity lottery program.
We're asking Congress to support our immigration policy that keeps terrorists, drug dealers, criminals, and gang members out of our country. We want them out. We don't want them in. And right now we're working on DACA, we're working on immigration bills, and we're making them tough so you people can enforce the laws.
If Trump gets what he wants, he says he's willing to give a pathway to citizenship to the 1.8 million people who are eligible for DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that expires March 5th. So, what's the chance of this happening?
Well, I think we began the week with the assumption that anything that could get through Congress and land on President Trump's desk would be signed. When he came out with this veto threat, we now realize that it's going to be a lot harder to get it out of Congress. I think the veto threat was aimed primarily at the House, which is going to basically what a lot of these House members from conservative districts would have needed was some kind of political cover from President Trump. I think he served notice they're not going to get it.
I'm afraid that's right. I think that's a very good analysis. I think what's fascinating about what's going on here was really underscored by our colleague Greg Sargent, who blogs at the Plumline blog, where he said you're really seeing an asymmetric negotiation here where the people who want to help dreamers and legalize their situation, which is virtually all Democrats and some Republicans, are willing to offer all kinds of compromises to try to bring Trump around, to give him quite a bit. On the other side of the negotiation are folks, including especially the president, who say, well, we want to compromise, but actually they're saying, give us everything we want or we won't protect the dreamers. That's a very weird way to carry out a negotiation. And I think one of the questions will be if the Senate can actually produce a bill that is not, I don't think the Trump bill can't pass the Senate because Democrats will oppose it. But if a bill that protects the dreamers, that makes some concessions to Trump's position, can get 60 votes, it'll be very interesting to see where does the House go there. because that really then puts a lot of pressure on Paul Ryan. Right now, he can take the position he's taking, and since no one else is passing legislation, he doesn't have to be fully accountable for it. If the Senate passes something, that creates a moment of accountability for Paul Ryan.
And it'll be interesting to see, too, whether he actually decides he's going to have to get some Democratic votes on this, which would be a situation we have not seen Paul Ryan in very often.
Right, and Karen, you were talking, I thought it was interesting, a little bit about how Mitch McConnell might stage these votes to make it look the worst possible for the Democrats and the best possible for the Republicans.
Right, and again, it's only Thursday, and things are very fluid. But one big issue is in these proposals, what order they come in, because if he puts some version of the president's proposal last, then that's going to be sitting there waiting for people. If it was an early vote and it failed, then everybody could say, oh, well, we're going to go to this bipartisan compromise as a backup. But if you make the president's proposal the last vote, then you're not going to give your members that kind of wiggle room on voting for the bipartisan compromise.
I do think it's interesting how compromise has been framed throughout this entire debate,
Yes.
right? Most Americans are actually in favor of some sort of protection or pathway to citizenship for Dreamers. That's not actually that controversial. No. But it's been set up, especially by Republicans, as sort of an out there thing that actually nobody wants, and giving anything to the Dreamers should be seen as a huge concession, when in fact it really isn't. But it forces the Democrats to then, yes, say that they'll compromise on this or that, or try and offer up all sorts of things so that they can get what is then portrayed as a really out there and terrifying agreement.
Amen to that. And it's even, it's the fact is that Trump himself created this problem by getting rid of the Obama executive order. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like somebody saying, oh, well, I took your wallet, but I'll give you back your wallet if you make some concessions to me. It's a crazy situation.
Yeah.
So I think we can move on to another security issue. Trump is focused on border security, but he's raised no concerns about the other national security threat posed by Russia. His top intelligence chiefs did just that at a Senate Intelligence Committee hearing Tuesday. Here's Director of National Intelligence Daniel Coates discussing the threat to the U.S. midterm elections.
We expect Russia to continue using propaganda, social media, false flag personas, sympathetic spokesmen, and other means to influence to try to build on its wide range of operations and exacerbate social and political fissures in the United States. There should be no doubt that Russia perceived that its past efforts as successful and views the 2018 U.S. midterm elections as a potential target for Russian influence operations.
So, are we prepared for this threat?
No. First of all, just a parentheses, I'd love to know whom Mr. Coates was thinking of when he said sympathetic spokesman for Russia. I'd love to see that list. Who is he talking about? Mm-hmm. What's remarkable is the disconnect, and obviously I'm not the first person to point this out, between what President Trump's intelligence officials say and what President Trump says. What they say must be done, and President Trump not pushing the government, moving the government to do anything at all. His intelligence chiefs worry about this impact on our democracy. President Trump seems only to worry about how this would taint his glorious victory that he likes to talk about and might feed the Russia investigation that he would like to quash. And it's just an absolute difference of view inside his own administration.
Right. I mean, the obvious assumption that I think pretty much everybody who's watching this situation can make is that, no, Donald Trump doesn't want to talk about or face the fact that Russian influence might be a problem in the upcoming election or in past elections, because, yes, it casts doubt on him. Of course he doesn't want to talk about whether Russian support helped push him over the edge, because, yes, that implicates him in this Russia investigation. Like, we know why he doesn't want to get into this, and it's extremely obvious from the way that he continually talks around it or ignores it or downplays it, even as pretty much everyone else in the government, in the intelligence community, even in the media says, yes, this is happening.
And then, of course, there was the additional threat that they brought up that the intelligence chiefs did, which is that the Chinese are out there as well. And they said they have a much bigger footprint where the Russians use these sort of clumsy tactics, bots and fake media, social media accounts. The Chinese have much more economic power. They have much better developed capabilities to essentially, hack into our electronic systems. They have a lot of power over companies like Facebook and Google that in a lot of ways, they were making the argument that they are an even greater threat to the sort of sanctity of our system.
Right, and you've seen Chinese influence surface in other countries, notably Australia, in sometimes scandalous ways. That's absolutely right. And there are two sides to this. One is the influence on elections and the public argument. And there was a very interesting report that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee Democratic staff put out, led by Senator Cardin on the Democratic side. And what was fascinating is so many other countries, so many other democracies have actually taken strong and affirmative steps to fight this at a time when we haven't fought this. But I just want to say one other thing, because I rarely agree with Grover Norquist, the great anti-tax activist, but I discovered recently we agree on something, which is I am for returning to paper ballots. That's another side of this problem. And yes, you can have machine-counted paper ballots like we have where I live in Maryland, but paper ballots, I think, are essential to protecting us. The Netherlands did it in their last election. So I say that because there's very little agreement across ideological lines these days. I found one issue where we seem to have accord.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. On Facebook, Elaine Johnson says the vote to escalate the sanctions on Russia was technically veto-proof. Let him, that'd be Trump, veto it, and then they can vote again to overrule it. I do think it's interesting to look at exactly what kind of damage it does to have the president be talking in a way that's minimizing this threat. We had another piece today. We've had some really good pieces on what we can do to protect against this. This one was by Mike Rogers and Rick Legend, and it said, here are 4 steps we can take. And one of the steps was simply issue this declaration that says, if you do this, if you undermine our elections, we view that as a sort of attack on America. We don't have anything like that. And in France, for example, they say this in the op-ed, they do, and then they've worked together with companies to publicly debunk this kind of stuff. So it seems like leadership, even just in words, is really useful, and we're not getting any of that.
I think one of the interesting things, and one of the interesting things to watch in our response to this problem will be not necessarily just political, but also sort of the business and technical and media reaction to this potential threat. One of the reasons why misinformation was allowed to spread unchecked on Facebook and Twitter, many have hypothesized, there's been a lot of writing about this recently, is that it does seem to produce lively discussion. People sign up. These bots are seen as Twitter or Facebook users, and that's pretty profitable for Facebook and Twitter. And for them to take a stand and say, we are going to push this audience off of our platforms, first, it makes them seem like a gatekeeper, sort of a media platform, and they don't want that responsibility. And second, it could damage their profitability, and they are scared of doing that. And the question will be, where does their loyalty really lie? Like, do they care more about American democracy and the sanctity of our elections, or are they just trying to make a buck however they can?
No, this is huge. I thought one of the most fascinating stories to come out of this was that the Russians had set up an anti-Muslim group in Texas. I think it was in Dallas, but it was in Texas somewhere. And then a group of Muslims to oppose the anti-Muslim group. And the anti-Muslim group called a demonstration, and the pro-Muslim group called a counter-demonstration. And so they created a confrontation on a whole cloth. There was not a single Texan involved in this. They just pulled this off online. That's extraordinary. But what it also shows is how they are prepared to take advantage of our own internal divisions. And I think the cost of leadership that actually tries to drive further wedges into our country is really brought home when you're in a situation where an adversary can just take advantage of of those divisions in that way.
So, Twitter and Facebook, should the government be exercising more oversight, or is that going to end up being a threat to how freely people can speak on these platforms?
I am uncomfortable with that too. I don't think that these kinds of companies have yet sort of reached the point where we should look at them as sort of public utilities. So I honestly, I mean, I sort of get really sort of conflicted in this entire argument.
I'm more sympathetic to the public utility view, but whether you take that or not, I do think it's not an attack on free speech to say that to have these rights, you have to be an actual human being. You can't be an invented person by a foreign power. I don't think that removes any American's rights. It doesn't even remove any non-Americans' rights. It just says you got to be the person you say you are. You can't be invented. And I think if we started there, we might get somewhere.
But it also implicates us as individuals, as citizens. And I think you've spoken to this really well when you talk about partisanship. Like the idea that people are so interested in and so willing to share sort of any news that appears to agree with their point of view, no matter where it comes from, without investigating the background or whether it's true or not. That's what makes all of this possible. That's what makes a sharing and spread of misinformation possible. People not being skeptical of the information that they receive and being incredibly willing to push whatever their narrative is with whatever information they have, whether or not it's true. And I think as citizens, as a country, I think we're going to have to begin to sort of take responsibility for our news, for what we share, you know, for how we protect our country. And can we do that? I don't know. It's becoming harder and harder and more partisan, and people are less and less interested in challenging their preferred point of view. So that's something that worries me a lot going forward, Russians aside.
As you were talking, I was thinking we do enough damage to each other. We don't need an outside power to make it worse, you know?
Well, I guess that's one area where we can exercise a modicum of control when everything else feels like it's totally out of our hands, and this week in a pretty sad way. We are out of time, but we're not out of opinions, so stay with us on WashingtonPost.com/opinions, and remember, for better or for worse, it's only Thursday.